The story of Rome began when a prince named Aeneas fled Troy after its destruction during the Trojan War, and intermixed his people with those of the Latins in Italy. From their descendants came the two mythical sons Romulus and Remus, who were cast out to die because their mother, Rhea Silvia, was forbidden from bearing children. But Romulus and Remus's father was the god Mars, god of war, and his children survived and were taken in by a shepherd who raised the boys to adulthood. Following in their dad's warfaring footsteps, Romulus and Remus helped topple a usurping king from their mom's hometown and reinstall the rightful ruler. Then, they departed to found their own cities on the 7 hills of Rome. It was then that Romulus famously slew his brother Remus, leaving Romulus the sole ruler. As Romulus's new city of Rome grew, the Romans would come to be characterized by their strong military power, as well as Rome's tendency to adopt elements from their neighbors and the nations they conquered, such as the columns of the Etruscans, the art of the Greeks, and the wives of the Sabines. But Rome was also a cultural force unto itself, and where Rome conquered, its people were often inclined to adopt Roman practices and to become part of the Roman Empire themselves. Romulus was the first of the 7 kings of Rome, and over the course of 200 years, from the 700s BC, Romulus was succeeded by Numa, Tullus, Ancus, Tarquin the Elder, Servius, and Tarquin the Proud. Because of the moral decay of Tarquin the Proud and that of his family, the people of Rome rejected the singular monarchy in the 500s BC, and instead split the power of Rome, or the imperium, between 2 chosen officials, the Roman consuls. The consuls worked alongside the power of the Roman Senate, a body which existed throughout the multiple governmental systems of Rome, sometimes as advisors and sometimes more as legislators, depending on how powerful and persuasive the leader or leaders of Rome happened to be. Sometimes that leader was not the Roman consuls, but the Roman dictator. The Roman dictator was one of the most interesting roles in Roman life during the Republic, a position chosen by the Senate and consuls to stand even above the consuls themselves during a time of extreme crisis. Like many of the offices of Rome, it shifted in style and implementation throughout the Republic, but the idea behind the office of the dictator was that it was always a temporary position to deal with a specific crisis at hand, after which the normal governmental apparatus would resume, which it did throughout much of the tenure of the Republic. The crisis most proper to the dictator was a military crisis or conflict. Of the many wars and conflicts fought by Rome, many would be wars of expansion. Rome was not always a great empire, and initially it did not even control the bulk of modern-day Italy. So how did Rome go from looking like this to looking like this? The first stage was to gain control over their immediate neighbors, which involved allying or conquering those to the north and south. While many of these neighbors were smaller nations or tribes, eventually Rome was pulled into conflict with the Greek colonies in southern Italy, who received support from the more powerful mainland Greece in the form of King Pyrrhus and his army. After a costly conflict with many fatalities on both sides, Rome was able to drive Pyrrhus away and by the 200s BC had gained control of all of Italy. Though Rome's expansion had been comparatively slow at first, over the next 200 years Rome conquered large swaths of modern-day Spain, France, Greece, Turkey, and North Africa, along the way toppling great adversaries like Carthage during the 3 Punic Wars, Syria in the Mithratic Wars, and even the once great Egypt. By the time of the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, the Romans occupied a territory on a similar scale to what Alexander the Great once controlled. During these important military conflicts, which followed the fall of the monarchy, there were many dictators who temporarily assumed the supreme power of the Roman government. The most famous of these dictators was Julius Caesar, who became extremely influential and wealthy after defeating the Celts in the Gallic Wars. Caesar would achieve further political success through alliance with Crassus and Pompey, who were collectively known as the Triumvirate. But after Crassus's death and the death of Caesar's daughter, who was also Pompey's wife, Pompey and Caesar became direct rivals, with Pompey directing the Senate against Caesar, to which Caesar responded by crossing the Rubicon and invading Rome. Though Caesar's bid for power would eventually end in his famous assassination by the Roman Senate and his friend Brutus, following Caesar's abrupt fall from grace, there was uproar in Rome between the pro- and anti-Caesar factions. When things stabilized, there was a new triumvirate alliance formed by Mark Antony, a distant relative of Caesar, Lepidus, one of Caesar's allies, and Octavius, Caesar's adopted son. Mark Antony is famous among the three for starting a long-lasting affair with the Egyptian Cleopatra VII, with whom he fathered several children. Like the first triumvirate, relations between the second deteriorated to the point of war, culminating in a great battle with Mark Antony and Cleopatra on one side and Octavius on the other. Octavius emerged the victor and new ruler of Rome, and from him a new governmental structure would emerge, which was referred to as the Principate. While Octavius, who was by now called Caesar Augustus, would keep the trappings of the old Roman government, such as the Senate and the consuls, in reality, Augustus would now occupy many of these roles either directly or indirectly, and was effectively the emperor, though at this time it was still too politically dangerous to explicitly say so. Augustus's effective reign would launch a period of Roman history that was called the Pax Romana, or Peace of Rome. To maintain this peace and avoid the civil war that resulted from the original Caesar's death, Augustus directly nominated Tiberius to succeed him. While Tiberius was considered a more brutal and paranoid leader than Augustus, being known to execute supposed traitors for the flimsiest of causes, Tiberius maintained the status quo and the Roman peace. The transition from Tiberius to his own successor Caligula was likewise without incident, but the reign of Caligula was not devoid of tension, as he began to demand not merely that he be treated as emperor, but that he be called a god, as well as famously making his own horse a consul despite the Senate, saying that the Senate was no better than a horse. Fed up with Caligula, the Praetorian Guard, the guard whose job it was to protect high-ranking Romans, assassinated Caligula. In the brief power vacuum that resulted, there were some within the Senate who wished to formally return to the genuine Roman Republic, but instead, a pro-emperor section of the Praetorian Guard grabbed Caligula's uncle Claudius, who was judiciously hiding behind a curtain, and decided to make him the new emperor. Claudius expanded the borders of Rome and extended Roman citizenship, making groups with no Italian ancestry not just citizens, but even allowing some into the Roman Senate. Claudius's reign came to an end when his wife, who was also his niece, assassinated him to ensure that her son Nero, to whom Claudius was only a stepfather, would succeed Claudius as emperor. Nero remains one of the most famous Roman emperors for his cruelty to the Christians and debaucherous lifestyle. He was also known for forcing people to watch him perform on stage, from which Suetonius notes that Romans feigned death so that they could escape the performance, while others were forced to give birth from the crowd because Nero wouldn't let anyone leave. Nero was the last of the initial Principate emperors of Rome, and his reign came to an end after he fled Rome because of widespread discontent, declaring before his suicide, "What an artist the world is losing." With succession in the Roman Republic up for grabs, Nero's absence created the year of the Four Emperors, where multiple leaders proclaimed themselves emperor before being murdered by their respective detractors. But the fourth emperor, Vespasian, successfully laid claim to the empire, and wrapped his claim in legitimacy by getting the Senate to confirm him. For the next 30 years, Rome was ruled by Vespasian's Flavian Dynasty, which briefly included Titus and later Domitian. Vespasian preserved the peace of Rome and executed further social reforms to strengthen Rome. However, when Domitian's horrific rule resulted in his assassination, the Senate picked their own emperor directly, Nerva, who was the first of the 5 good emperors. Nerva decided to help maintain the status quo by adopting a person to succeed him, in a similar manner to a monarchy, but distinct because of the adoption practice. Nerva's son was Trajan, whose time as emperor oversaw the largest territorial extent of Rome, a size it would never achieve again. Trajan's reign was also a wealthy one, and he began many philanthropic and social works projects. Trajan was followed in a peaceful transition by Hadrian, Antonius Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, emperors who were selected based on merit rather than hereditary status, hence their place in history as the 5 good emperors. Marcus Aurelius was succeeded as emperor by his son Commodus, whom Marcus selected despite knowing that the last several emperors selected emperors by adoption, to say nothing of Commodus's many moral failings. Commodus had neither his father Marcus Aurelius's wisdom nor discipline, and his outrageous lifestyle and general unpopularity led to his assassination after a dozen years of rule. Yet in the aftermath of Commodus's death, Rome's leadership was once again in question, with the year of the 5 emperors. Scandalously, this year featured 2 wealthy aristocrats trying to win a bidding war for who would be the new leader of Rome, but the results of this auction became irrelevant when Septimius Severus, an African general in the south of the empire, marched on Rome and put a stop to that, installing himself as a militaristic ruler over the Roman government. As emperor, Septimius Severus inherited the problems of Marcus Aurelius. Rome was running low on cash, and a major reason was the military conflicts with barbarians along the Roman border. These problems were worsened by Marcus and Septimus's decision to devalue the currency with less valuable metals over time. The historian Herodian also blamed Septimus's leniency and breakdown of discipline with the army for failures in quelling barbarian influence. The military increasingly came to dominate political life and the Roman government during this period, and with the end of Septimus's dynasty after the emperor Severus Alexander was lynched by disgruntled troops, civil infighting increased in the Roman Empire, a time called the crisis of the 3rd century. Without clear leadership, since emperors came and went after only a few years, the Roman border crisis grew worse and worse, and Rome's currency became even more inflated, with some payments reverting to little better than a barter system. This civil crisis was ended by the arrival of Diocletian. Diocletian brought order back to Rome, though it came at the cost of the vestiges of the old Roman Republic, which Diocletian wholly dissolved, thus starting what history refers to as the Dominate period of imperial rule in Rome. Under Diocletian, the bureaucracy of Rome was overhauled, and he created the jurisdictional system called the diocese. The diocesan organization of Rome is noteworthy, because it is the same system that the Catholic Church would take over when deciding which bishops were in charge of what territory, and today the Church has extended it even to countries far beyond Rome. At the military level, this bureaucratic shift was done to discourage revolt. But Diocletian also divided his own position and created the Tetrarchy with 4 rulers for different quadrants of the empire, but with 2 of these rulers acting as junior emperors who would succeed the senior emperors. Diocletian worked hard to transition power peacefully, voluntarily relinquishing his office, and being the first emperor of the last 57 to die of natural causes rather than malice. However, civil war and competition for leadership resumed after Diocletian as it had before him. However, this time it was different. This time the new emperor was Constantine. Constantine is most famous for being the first emperor to openly legitimize Christianity with the Edict of Milan, a move famously motivated by Constantine's vision of the Chi Rho, a symbol for Jesus Christ, which allowed Constantine to win the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. With Constantine's support, Christianity began to be practiced ever more openly throughout the empire, and what was once a nation of men who worshipped Jupiter began to become one that worshipped God. Constantine went so far as to found a city intended to be Christian in its very design, the city of Constantinople, which was the new capital. Constantine's rule allowed for many changes in the empire, the most socially relevant of which was that within a few decades, every emperor going forward would be a Christian. In 380, the Edict of Thessalonica was instituted by the Emperor Theodosius, which made Christianity the Roman religion. Theodosius also fully split the Western and Eastern Roman empires apart, giving half to one son and half to the other. In the background of this great social change, the barbarian encroachment on the Roman border continued to grow worse. Famous tribes like the Visigoths and the Vandals made it further and further into Western Rome, and in the 400s they successfully sacked Rome itself on 2 occasions. A century and a half after Constantine, in 476 AD, with the Western Roman Empire coming apart at the seams, barbarians successfully deposed the last Roman emperor, who was ironically named Romulus. Although there was a great deal of continuity between the eastern half of the empire and the western half, Western Rome as it once was no more. Of course, the people who populated what was once the Roman Empire were still there. As the barbarians who brought so much instability to the empire began to settle down, the various provinces of Rome were more fully assimilated with barbarians of northern Europe, and would develop their own culture and new languages from the Old Latin dialect, thus ending the period of Rome and beginning the Middle Ages. Thanks for watching, and thanks to everyone who helped behind the scenes to revise my script, to remove errors and to correct pronunciation. History summaries are a lot more difficult to write about than fiction, and the stakes are higher because it matters more if you get it wrong. So I'm glad I ran it by some people first. Let me know if you'd prefer more stick figure videos about fiction, or if you'd prefer something else more history related, and maybe I'll see you next year.